There's been quite the controversy over Elden Ring Nightreign after the official playable network test went live. A lot of praise and a lot of complaints instantly swept across the internet now that actual gameplay and reviews have been made public, some even going as far as labeling Nightreign a straight up cash grab SLOP. And to say this before people start skipping around, I actually really like Nightreign. It was some of the most fun I've had in months. But for the sake of the network test, I only want to focus on issues that I believe will likely persist beyond the network test and the issues that might unfortunately extend into the full release final version. Also, I just realized that this video is uploaded on Elden Ring's 3rd year anniversary. That's where I got my start on this channel, and despite branching out into other games now, still holds a special place in my heart. So thank you all for supporting me all these years. I don't know where I'd be without you guys. I wanted to give my own take on everything because I've played all 6 network tests total, including the bonus test. Since the first day of testing, hardly anyone got to play for more than 10 minutes due to PlayStation 5 servers exploding. Luckily, at the same time, all 10 people who actually purchased an Xbox were able to play without many issues. After experiencing all 18 possible hours of the playable network test, and with over 3,000 hours in Elden Ring, I know what iSouls like and what iSouls don't. Fucking kill me. Anyways, my review is going to be a big long yap session with both positive and constructive criticism because I really want to see Nightreign reach its full potential, and it's already so close to being there. There are just several areas that I feel like aren't being properly discussed by the community, and I want to highlight aspects that could significantly improve the game's longevity. I mainly want to address the corporate greed SLOP allegations, the core gameplay loop, and what I believe is the most pressing concern, the game's progression system, or in my opinion, the lack thereof. Then, at the very end, I'll briefly go over what I'd like to be added or hope to see some iterations of ideas and or concepts that can keep players engaged long term, at least longer than the month that it releases in before people start to get burnt out. And if for some reason you aren't familiar with Nightraign's gameplay, here's a brief summary. You drop in Fortnite style into a map that has randomly generated points of interest. Run around grinding levels via defeating enemies for runes, except your stats are predetermined based on the class you selected. Randomly, you'll find better gear to help you fight bosses at the end of each day, while the damaging storm closes in around you. The first 2 bosses will always be random, but the final boss will always remain the same depending on the expedition you selected. Simple enough, right? You play it solo or with up to 3 people total. The full standalone game releases on May 30th later this year. And no, this isn't sponsored at all. I'm just bringing up the release date to highlight an important point. This playable network test and the final build are not that far apart, which is a bit concerning in my opinion. It makes me wonder just how close this test version is to the final product, given that there are less than 3 months left until its official launch. Again, I'm very aware that the network test focuses on stability and server performance first, but the groundwork for additional systems and long-term progression felt strangely absent. You could barely see and feel only a handful of elements that would be likely to be expanded upon when the game fully releases, which for me raises a little concern about how much can realistically change between the network test version and the final release version. But we'll get more into this later. I promise not everything is going to be negative. Now let's get into the very first topic. Is Nightreign really just rehash SLOP? This claim has been circulating quite a bit around the internet, and my answer to it is it always has been. And I mean that in the most endearing way possible, because it's also why Souls games are so loved. I'm not sure if this is a hot take, but every single title in the Souls catalog has reused assets from all past games before them, and that's not a bad thing. It's only more noticeable in Nightreign because they're all in one place and out of their original settings, which is why I think people are upset seeing it in mass. It's not because it's wrong to do, but because people are just finally noticing that From Software really knows how to get their money's worth with every asset they have ever made in any of their games.
I was just like, damn, that's an artist check. It's literally an exact copy, and it even has the same cracks on the wood panels over in the pooing house on the side here through this archway, and I was like, dude, this shit is in Elden Ring. And I was right. Here it is, dude. This is the exact same archway, dude.
Again, this is not inherently a bad thing either, because it's the only reason a game like Nightreign could have been produced so quickly after we just got Shadow of the Erdtree less than a year ago. Nightreign isn't meant to be a revolutionary title that reinvents the Souls genre. It's just more Elden Ring for people who want more Elden Ring, in an easily accessible and replayable core gameplay loop with some unique twists on top. Is that lazy? Sure, but when it's done well enough, that's not inherently an issue either. The reuse of assets in familiar locations or mechanics should not be seen as a bad thing. The only bad part would be if it was poorly executed, which in my opinion, Nightreign handled it well. I didn't mind reuse of assets because it allowed me to focus more on what wasn't reused, and it made it easier to identify all the actual brand new content. The best example of this was the Recluse class. The reason I main her and the reason she's my most played character, who I selected for every session of the network tests, was a direct result of her being the most nuanced and brand new content by From Software that we've had in years. Everything about this class felt so distinct. It was such a breath of fresh air to see From Software's take on the Invoker archetype and play the Recluse class despite its reuse of assets. A level of depth to her skills for her magic cocktail, having nearly 14 combinations of mixtures that can produce an abundance of unique spells that truly test the player's knowledge by challenging you to either make do with what you had or go further beyond by formulating dynamic mixtures for various scenarios, all while needing to sustain your FP without the use of blue pots. This is something that you can easily tell has had the most development and time spent on it. And it's because of these reuse of assets that FromSoft can achieve such depth of character in such a short time. This is especially true for the Recluse class as a mage, being unlike anything we've experienced in any previous From Software titles. Some Recluse magic cocktail spells were completely unique and never seen before, but other spells I still got excited at despite them being reused assets because they were previously assets that were inaccessible to the player. That reuse of assets only made it better when I recognized that this spell, for example, was literally the fucking nuke that Plagisax uses. You know, the big lightning nuke that he uses that cuts out the music in the middle of his boss fight?
How much damage is this? Right at the center. 1,364. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that one. For years, I wish I could use Placid's nuke as a spell or Ash of War in base Elden Ring, or just in general the feeling of wanting to be able to use specific boss spells or attacks that were previously unavailable to the player. Being a reused asset didn't matter because it wasn't even something that you could access previously, and the Recluse is the start of where that gap becomes bridged, allowing players to access previous inaccessible content. Not to mention, it was extremely satisfying and rewarding to play, keeping each game dynamic based on whatever elements you were able to obtain. And I have a full Recluse guide here if you want to watch how that works, but to wrap up this segment, reusing assets is not something new to From Software titles, and you're allowed to dislike it, but it's also what allows us to get such unique content like the Recluse in such a short development time. Even if we look at the bosses in the base game being reused, some are worse than others, but I really like the reuse of the Centipede boss from Dark Souls 1 and especially love the Morgott fight, because I think From Software wants him to fill this role of a master and a teacher for us the players as the student. I noticed this because during the new version of the Morgott fight, when he used his brand new machine gun rapid fire holy knives attack that was way faster than he's ever done before, it was an attack that if you just spam rolled would still end up hitting you due to how fast he threw them out. However, the new attack is meant to reinforce the player's use of brand new mechanics, specifically teaching us to rely on the new surge sprint mechanic. Speed of Morgott's throwing knives make it clear that rolling isn't the ideal solution here, but the tracking on the knives is not very accurate, so surge sprinting becomes the clear way to avoid being damaged from this attack, guiding and reinforcing the player to try these new mechanics. Just like in previous encounters, Margit still excels at pushing the players to new heights, making this reused asset fight feel like a natural evolution of Margit's role as a teacher to us, the players. It was a small detail that I don't think a lot of people noticed, but I really appreciated it. Although, while we're on the topic of bosses, they were not all equally satisfying. I genuinely despise the Draconic Tree Sentinel fights and the Demi-Human Queen fights. These were very generic feeling, with artificial difficulty coming from them both being gank fights with tons of HP and defenses. I've defeated all bosses in the network tests multiple times, but these were by far the most uninspiring and low-effort fights of the network test, and I really hope this pattern doesn't continue for the boss fights to just become multiple copy-paste high-stat stick enemies. However, the final boss was fun and engaging, but honestly, it was a lot easier than I expected. And I don't mean that in a conceited way either. I felt like it was just a stronger version of the Red Wolf of Radagon, but that was about it. Thematically and conceptually, it was a 10 out of 10 masterpiece cinematic fight, but it was just a bit underwhelming, leaving me wanting more from the fight, and after defeating it, kinda just going, that's it. I think the way the boss splits into multiple wolves is fun and quirky because unlike other gank fights, all three wolves shared the same HP bar while having individual status resistances. This allows players to take advantage of multiple status procs, as I discovered, such as bleed or frostbite on each individual wolf, all while dealing damage to the shared health pool. This created an interesting trade-off, allowing players to min-max their damage but at the cost of making the fight more challenging. Unlike typical gank fights where each enemy had a separate HP bar, the shared health pool made this encounter encounter feel unique and not as gimmicky. Not to mention, I love the use of the sword on its back being reminiscent of Sif, but I really was just hoping for a significantly unique second phase or just something more along those lines. I don't know, it just felt like the fight left me wanting more after I defeated it, since the boss itself had pretty limited movesets to begin with. It's not a bad fight by any means, but honestly, I just kinda expected more from it, especially after the promotional trailers and the bosses that we fought in Shadow of the Erdtree. I think that while this fight was thematically amazing, it had less depth to it compared to something like the Dancing Lion fight, for example, which felt way more fleshed out than the wolf. Maybe we were just spoiled, but I hope this feeling doesn't become a reoccurring pattern when more bosses get added to the game later. So now that we've addressed the slop and reuse of assets allegations as nothing burgers, let's talk about the core gameplay loop and progression, because this is the area that I don't feel like is being discussed enough, and it's where I have the most mixed feelings. First off, I need to emphasize that I'm not here to solely focus on the negatives. Nightreign has been the most fun I've had playing with friends in a long time. That said, my concern for the game's release is that it might lack the depth and progression needed to keep players engaged in the long term, especially longer than just the month that it releases. I fear that those unique and memorable moments that we created over last weekend could fade out in just a month or so, especially now after it's been pretty much confirmed that From Software isn't exactly interested in making Nightreign a live service game. It leaves a little bit of an empty feeling where the excitement should be, knowing the fact that this game will not be receiving consistent updates or content and only irregularly get things at best only adds to my concern, especially while the foundation of a core gameplay progression is missing. Core gameplay shows significant potential already, with From Software demonstrating a willingness to experiment with new mechanics. However, this potential is somewhat hindered by a reluctance to fully commit to a completely new approach. The game's biggest shortcomings, in my opinion, might be that it plays too safely, striving for dynamism while still adhering to the traditional Souls design principles, rather than embracing their more unconventional ideas. It's in these more unconventional ideas, such as the movement system, character ultimates, and abilities, that I initially found those mechanics to feel somewhat strange and unfitting. However, the more I actually engaged with them, the greater my sense of satisfaction towards them became. Mechanics like wall running and scaling geometry initially felt out of place in a Souls game because you could never do that before. After being able to actually experience the new movement system, it felt like it had always belonged in a game like Elden Ring in the first place. The freedom of movement and airborne travel grew on me very quickly. Similar design choices, such as their interpretation of the Invoker archetype through the Recluse class, further highlight From Software's evolving and nuanced approach to gameplay. I really appreciate that From Software took a risk with this game by introducing new ideas and concepts, but it feels like it just falls a little short of reaching its true potential. I feel like the game seems to hold itself back, too hesitant to stray too far from the core Souls gameplay experience of Elden Ring that players are used to. What few new changes exist, like the Battle Royale circle and the roguelike experience, already sparked polarization and disagreement within the player base, and those are pretty minor changes. To me, this shows that maybe a more decisive approach, either fully embracing innovation or staying closer to the traditional Souls formula, might have been more effective, and that currently it's trying to play this middle ground that doesn't go too far in either direction. Personally speaking, I wish they pushed the envelope a lot more, because those unique and inspired areas that were initially off-putting and felt out of place became the highlight to Nightreign for me, where I could feel the developer's desire to share something new with us. So, I say what I'm about to say, not from a place of malice, but rather a place from a genuine desire to see Nightreign succeed and become something I'll continue playing long after its release. First off, again, the game was extremely fun, especially with friends, but that's also one of its biggest faults. Playing with random people was absolutely frustrating. During the first few test sessions, you were forced to queue in groups of 3, but you couldn't use passwords at first, meaning every match was with 2 randoms and no communication, everyone just branching off to do their own thing, save for a bare bones ping system. Was this a major deal-breaking issue? Not really. I still managed to defeat the final boss with randoms, but in my opinion, it just wasn't fun. It felt like more of a chore, and I ran into plenty of players who would just quit and leave the game as soon as they got knocked down after wandering off in their own direction, refusing to stay together as a team. On the other hand, playing with my friends was some of the most fun I've ever had in a Souls game. When the game fully releases, there will be an option for a single-player experience or a randomly matched 3-player group, where you can enable passwords to play with your friends. But honestly though, if I'm not playing with a pre-made group of 3 friends, I wouldn't even consider the multiplayer aspect at all. I would only stick to this single-player mode, and I feel like that's a pretty big concern for the game's longevity, especially since Nightreign feels designed to be a co-op experience. This is where we go back to pushing the envelope, because while this is not traditionally something that you would see in a Souls game, I think that if there was some form of voice chat, whether proximity or party chat, it would make these random sessions more engaging engaging or at the very least more enjoyable. While the lack of communication wasn't a major issue, if you don't have a 3-man pre-made party, I don't really see the value in playing with random people. I'd rather just play with my friends, and if they're busy, go solo in the current state of the game. Later, when you actually get into the game, a lot of the items and gear that you could find were just utter garbage for the most part, which was a major issue I was feeling. Most items, and especially consumables, just felt like they existed to fill up the loot tables in the game rather than have any meaningful impact. Things like throwing knives or pots felt relatively worthless to almost never pick up, since you could only hold around like 2 of each, with very limited inventory slots, which felt extremely off-putting not being able to stack them all in the same slot. In terms of weapons and upgrades, I'm perfectly okay with weapons being weaker than others, especially early on. It gives the game a sense of balance and a rewarding progression system through upgrading via smithing stones. However, I found that too many items felt like filler, and eventually I stopped collecting most of them altogether, save for a few ones that I knew were just very strong. The real upgrades just seemed to come from weapons with higher base damage, regardless of their rarity, which made rarity feel somewhat irrelevant. It often felt like getting stronger was more about RNG and finding a better weapon randomly, rather than actually upgrading what you already had or upgrading the weapon that you wanted to use, which I think is an extremely important factor that the game misses. Upgrading weapons didn't feel meaningful enough to make a noticeable difference, and it was always more valuable to just find something stronger instead of investing into upgrades for weapons that you wanted to use. Upgrading weapons only felt like something you would do if you had no luck or no other RNG options available to you. This diminished the sense of reward and limited the freedom to choose your build, as certain items were simply just better regardless of upgrades. I'd love to see a more fleshed out upgrade system that gives you more value from upgrading the items you actually want to use, rather than feeling like you're forced to choose the objectively stronger weapons or spells, which will tie all of this into the core progression of the game. Once again, in my opinion, the current state of the game lacks a clear indicator of mainline progression for the players. Think of it like this: when you play regular Elden Ring, what is your general sense of progression after defeating a boss? Or defeating enemies in general? Hell, even just looting new weapons or gear. These are all permanent changes to your character and the playstyle that allows your character to gain new levels, unlock new spells or weapons by investing into higher attributes to use them, and even things like great runes or boss remembrances for unique weapons or spells to completely change up your playstyle, allowing you to actually see and feel the progression of your accomplishments throughout the game. In Nightreign, the character progression is tightly bound to the moment-to-moment gameplay loop, which is not a bad thing. But once you defeat the final boss, you don't really receive anything substantial. The main rewards that you get are just relics, which act like talisman that you can mix and equip before embarking on another expedition. These relics essentially became the new way to create builds, but many of them felt underwhelming, and I wish they were a lot more dynamic, because some of them were. The other rewards you could get was a new currency called Merc, but both relics and Merc were given to the players regardless of your success or failures. You did get more rewards when successfully defeating all bosses, but there was nothing especially rewarding about it, since defeating the final boss didn't feel significantly more rewarding than not doing so. After defeating the final boss a handful of times, I found that I rarely received anything of value beyond the initial "hey, I did it" feeling, which quickly faded as I kept defeating it in consecutive sessions. The relic system is a fantastic concept, but I feel like they aren't going to be fleshed out enough when the game fully releases. I hope I'm wrong, but in the network test, most of them were fairly generic. Few of them really stood out because they were the only ones that completely changed your moveset and abilities, which I think those were the highlights of the relic system, and I wish that this got capitalized on more. For example, there was one for Wyler that transformed his grapple hook into a mini flaming strike, coating his weapon with fire damage afterwards. Another relic for Duchess allowed the final hit in a light attack combo to repeat its damage. For Recluse, there was a relic that automatically spawned a Terra Magica every time you absorbed any element. And for the Guardian, you could share your items and heals in an AoE around you, affecting and applying to your teammates. These were some of the most dynamic relics that I encountered, but sadly, a majority of the relics did not have this level of impact. I wish that they had taken this concept way further, introducing completely new abilities from relics or more modifications to existing ones. It would have allowed for more diverse player builds, letting individuals express their preferred playstyles in more meaningful ways that would actually be a noticeable change and impact your gameplay from session to session more than just a few minor stat boosts. It also felt like the whole concept of a build still exists, but in a much more simplistic way, and lacks the depth that players are used to and love. I think relics need to gain way more depth and complexity as to what they can offer the players to completely change your gameplay, or at the very least allow classes to change their starting equipment ever so slightly. but at the cost of a relic slot. Something like skills or passive levels that could be added to allow players to still have meaningful builds more than just the relics and random gear that they pick up. Or even allowing players to keep certain items and materials gained from successfully clearing bosses in an expedition and bring back those items to the roundtable hold to create new relics or upgrade current ones. Or maybe unlock new items and passive abilities. There is so much potential for what relics and progression could be rather than what it currently is, where it's all just thrown at you regardless of winning or losing, and most of them being underwhelming. And of course, if you were to add anything that can make players stronger, you can always add more trade-offs to make the game harder. Even simple things like allowing the boss to build up bleed on the players so that they could actually make use of the boluses that they found in the game rather than just leaving them behind. Generally, it felt like there was nothing substantial to work towards in Nightreign. While it's possible that this is just a problem with the network test, I doubt that's entirely the case. With the full release less than 3 months away, there weren't many signs of solid progression systems in place that could be expanded upon when the game fully releases. Aside from a few NPCs to talk to and the relic system, both of these just felt unlikely to provide enough satisfaction and motivation to drive meaningful progression. I genuinely hope that when the full game releases, I'll be wrong on this, but currently there's just a noticeable lack of long-term goals and accomplishment for players to strive for. Compare this to the progression system in games like Hades, where both failure and success leads to new maps, starting weapons and starting gear, as well as customizable perks and in-depth passive bonuses, which also introduces new objectives or challenges as you progress, providing a sense of continual progression outside of its moment-to-moment gameplay loop. In Nightreign, the only objective seems to be surviving all 3 nights just to repeat the process with nothing to look forward to besides the relics. The reason the Recluse class stood out the most for me was due to its varied playstyle, requiring unique elements each game that you may or may not ever find due to the RNG, forcing you to adapt to each situation differently. I don't want to focus solely on the negatives though, because Nightreign is still a game that I thoroughly enjoyed, especially playing with friends. It was seriously the most fun I've had in months. Being able to play a consistent multiplayer Souls game that didn't come from a mod with people that I had wanted to play with for a long time. My concerns are just that for when the game fully releases is that it might lack the depth and progression needed to keep players engaged long term and much longer than the month that it releases in, before people start to get bored and move on. Nightreign is undeniably fun, offering an exciting and engaging experience, but for me, it just fell a little short when it came to long-term motivation while playing the network test, and I hope that when the game fully releases that I'll be wrong on this, because From Software took a risk with this game, introducing new ideas and fresh mechanics, and I'm glad they did, but it felt like they were just a little hesitant to fully commit to those innovations. While the gameplay is a blast in short bursts, the lack of meaningful progression, satisfying loot, and undesirable co-op features leaves a lot to be desired in terms of replayability. If FromSoft can improve these areas, especially co-op, looting systems, and progression, it could become something truly special, which is all I want for the game. Right now, Nightreign provides a great time for a limited duration, but everything I've gone over in this video makes me question if it'll have enough depth and substance to keep players coming back longer after its initial release. Again, I plan to give From Software the benefit of the doubt here and remain hopeful that its final release will offer more in terms of progression and long-term goals to work towards, because I want these moments that I made over the last weekend of the network test that made some of the best memories I've had in months playing with friends to last longer than a few weeks before people get burnt out or bored. Especially knowing that From Software has no intention of turning Nightreign into a live service game, it's clear that content and updates won't be as consistent. That makes it all the more important for the game to offer things for players to sink their time into and work towards outside of the core gameplay loop. So here's just a small summary of what I'd like to see, or at least something similar to. I think my previous points made it clear that Nightreign was just playing it a little too safe. People are already pushing back against its relatively minor changes like wall running, storm circles, and roguelike elements, and I genuinely don't believe that those ideas were bad. But the game felt like it's just towing the line rather than fully committing to bold innovations, which is what I want it to do. If Nightreign is going to break from Elden Ring's formula, it either needs to go all in or reconsider its direction, because as it stands, many players are already tuning it out. There are so many ways Nightreign could expand beyond its current design. Things like account levels, player stats and accolades, with detailed stat pages tracking the enemies slain or matches won, and a match history where players can review their past builds and what they were able to succeed with in a successful run. Even extra stats like maybe damage numbers, damage healed, or damage taken. In addition, consider letting players load into a session with pre-made loadouts or bonus items beyond just 3 relics to choose from. Introduce leaderboards of some fashion, not for pure competition, but for things like speedrun clear times that reset every few months and change based on the expedition you chose, with individual leaderboard ladders for each expedition. Even something like seasonal events or limited time bosses for even more special expeditions. Imagine like a 1 week only event where you get to challenge Ishin as the final boss and earn unique cosmetics for those who are able to defeat him, like granting players rewards that they wouldn't be able to achieve outside of this event. These kinds of features could give Nightreign the longevity and engagement that I think it needs. I genuinely want nothing more for this game to succeed in every way possible, but whether it does or not, we'll have to wait and see until it fully releases. And I'm hopeful that it will, because I guarantee you I will be putting more Elden Ring Nightreign content on this channel regardless. If you made it to the very end, thanks for listening to me yap. I've been SYROBE, and hopefully I'll see you all live on Twitch. Peace.